Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fensky. Elsa Hart set her first 3 mystery novels in 18th-century China. Her newest one is half a world away from that, in 18th-century England. The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne is set within the coterie of voracious collectors who lived in 1703 London. These men, and it was almost always men, devoted their disposable incomes to acquiring rarities of art and nature. When a prominent collector is murdered, an amateur botanist named Cecily Kay finds herself driven to right an injustice and solve the crime. It's a fascinating glimpse at a mostly forgotten scene, and it's a mystery that will delight Agatha Christie lovers and fans of historical fiction alike. And so joining me today to talk about it is its St. Louis-based author, Elsa Hart. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So you were living in China when you started what would become a 3-book series set there. But I understand you wrote this new book when you were living in St. Louis. What led you to set it in London?
Yes, so something I didn't know before I started writing novels is that by the time you're finished, you've created a lot of ghosts. These ghosts of characters who didn't end up finding a place in the story, or ghosts of plot points that had to be deleted. And the Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne started with one of those ghosts. When I wrote that first book set in China, I modeled one of its characters on a man named James Cunningham. And he was a Scottish ship's surgeon who journeyed to China in 1696. And when he announced he was going to do it, it was this huge deal because very few Westerners were going to China at that point. And he received all these instructions, including some from a London apothecary, on how to collect and preserve plants to bring back to England. And that character, who was inspired by Cunningham, didn't end up playing as big a role in that first book as I thought he would. So I had done all this research that I hadn't used, and I'd learned a little bit about this community of collectors who were waiting in England for items like Cunningham's pressed plants. And I always wanted to follow those specimens that he sent back, to follow them to England, to this community who was waiting for them. And so for the Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne, that is what I decided to do.
So this was a way of following these specimens and then introducing this whole new cast of characters. And as you set them in this world in 18th century England, it's really great. The reader feels like they're really there. The details feel so evocative. But I couldn't help but wonder how much 18th century England had in common with 18th century China. Did any of your prior research on living conditions and things like that carry over? Did you have to start from scratch in terms of things like that?
I pretty much had to start from scratch and consult a whole new set of resources. There's one character in common between the books set in China and the books set in England. So there was that, but he's an Englishman. But in terms of learning about what London was like at the time, I really relied on book research, and then was very lucky to be able to make a short trip to London and look for a house on which to model the house in which the book is set and the murder takes place.
So you found a specific house for this. How did you go about choosing, I want this to be the home of Barnaby Mayne?
It was very fun. I was looking for houses that were built in the late 1600s, of which there aren't all that many. And I found the model in actually Samuel Johnson's house, Dr. Johnson's house, which is open to visitors. And so I pretty much took the exact floor plan from that house and used it in the Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne, though in Cabinets, the collection of Barnaby Mayne is so big he's had to purchase the house next door as well. So I sort of doubled the space. But, for a mystery, especially one that takes place, in a sort of manor house style mystery, a floor plan is so important. So when I went and visited Dr. Johnson's house, I was kind of the creepy visitor that day, like standing in the stairwell and taking notes on like how much I could see into different rooms from what angles, and how much I could hear from one floor, eavesdropping on conversations on another floor. So that was hugely helpful, but I hope I didn't creep the docents out too much.
Yeah, so you were somewhat plotting a murder while you were visiting this house on tour. Did you explain to anyone, oh, I'm actually a mystery writer?
I didn't, not at all. I maybe should have. And again, I hope it didn't seem too creepy, but um, I was so much in my own head. I really just wandered around, and it was a wonderful place to visit when in the future travel is an option again. It's quiet and contains an enormous wealth of information about Samuel Johnson's life as well, for those who are interested.
Well, your historical research, it pays off not only in a murder that holds true to what could happen inside a house like this, but you also just had some wonderful details that struck me as someone who doesn't know much about this time. One of them was the idea of how they're displaying the body of the deceased for days on end, and people can come by and see this embalmed body. I assume this must have been the custom there. This isn't something you invented for the book.
It is, and I did find that in my research that a body might be out for up to about a week
Ugh.
for people to come by and pay their respects. And there were some rudimentary ways of trying to prevent it from being too unpleasant, using sort of straw and various ways of keeping the situation as dry as possible. But it did sound pretty gruesome, really.
Yeah, that was very gruesome, and I was also struck by just how cursory the police investigation was. Was that generally the case at this time in London?
You know, I manipulated a bit just for the sake of the story and having an amateur detective who was working pretty much on her own. But it was there certainly wasn't the any sort of system of criminal investigation in the same way that there is today or would have been even a few years later. It really was pretty neighborhood or parish specific, that you had people who were members of the community who were also in charge of policing it, but the level of organization with which they did so really kind of varied on the individual. And again, I mean, mysteries are so artificial as stories. Usually when somebody's murdered, it's pretty obvious who did it. There isn't, you know, a huge investigation needed. It's more of a chase the bad guy sort of situation.
And here,
So
this plays more like an Agatha Christie, where there's just any number of suspects who all happen to be within this closed environment. And, you know, the reader is sort of guessing along with Cecily Kay. Is it hard to make sure that the reader is staying a step behind, but not staying so far behind that they're lost?
it's a challenge, and I hope I do it well, but I really enjoy trying to do it because Agatha Christie has always been a huge influence on me, and the idea that at the core of the story there really is this kind of logic puzzle, and then you overlay human motivations and personalities on top of it, but it really is this very structured puzzle of a story, and I'm just really drawn to that, and I like doing it. I do rely heavily on outlines, so I outline the entire story before I even start trying to write a sentence, so that I know exactly which clues are going to be found when, and what deductions will be made from those. Which is not actually the case for all mystery writers. I sort of assumed it would be, but the more I talk to other writers, the more I learn that some are able to write and start the story without actually knowing who did it yet and figure it out as they go, which astounds me. I don't know how that would be possible.
They let the plot guide them, but it sounds like you know going in who done it. Have you ever found yourself changing on a major detail as you get to know these characters? You decide, you know what, I'm going to deviate from this outline.
Definitely, yes. I always think I'm not going to have to, because I have this outline that I think has worked everything out. But then, of course, when you really try to turn it into believable characters doing believable things, I run into two moments when a character I've created, it just doesn't make sense. I realize once I look at it closely, it doesn't make sense for them to act the way I need them to act for the plot. So then I do have to sometimes go back to the outline, rethink the different strands, pull them together, and whole characters often get squeezed out or deleted over the course of the writing process.
We're talking to author Elsa Hart about her new book. It's called The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne. It's a murder mystery. It's a wonderful read. And Elsa, your protagonist, this is new to this book, the amateur detective Cecily Kay. She's really a wonderful creation. I have to wonder, was it a relief to have that third-person omniscient perspective for a woman instead of a man?
It was. I mean, I loved and became dear friends with my protagonist of my previous novels, Lee Do, but I really enjoyed getting to know Cecily Kay. It wasn't easy, and I actually several months into writing the book was having a lot of trouble figuring out who this detective was. She's a plant enthusiast who has returned home to England after several years abroad, but she was a botanical enthusiast, an illustrator, a truth seeker, but she was also kind of roguish, and I couldn't get her to be consistent. And then this one afternoon, I got a phone call from one of my closest friends from graduate schools, and it was one of those phone calls where a friend calls and you just go right to these really intense subjects like meaning of life, career anxiety, family stress, like everything at once. And it was such a high energy conversation. And I hung up the phone and I realized in that moment what the trouble was with Cecily Kay was that I was trying to fit two characters into one, and that she wasn't one person, she was two. And that's when I created the character of her friend, Mackin Barlow. So I had these two women with different perspectives who could talk to each other. And that's really what the book needed. And then it really came together.
And that's interesting. As you explain that, I can totally see how it really does help to have these two. They can compare notes at points. At one point, you're not even sure if they can trust each other. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but the reader learns a lot through this friendship. And it's interesting because one of them, Cecily, she's obviously of a higher class than her friend. Did you examine how being an upper class woman gave her more or fewer limitations than if she'd been somebody like her friend McCann?
A little bit. It's a good question, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately as I work on thinking about a sequel to the book. But exactly so that there are some. Cecily has had advantages, but she's also had limitations, and particularly when she enters into this community of collectors, she is the one at a bit of a disadvantage because Mackin has been living within it and understanding how you can manipulate the people in this community who are often so obsessed about their collections that can be used. And so in some ways Mackin just has her balance a little bit more at the beginning, and Cecily has to figure out what's going on.
So yeah, the truly great theme of this book is about these collections. And I got the sense you almost had like a Jane Austen kind of tone, where a little bit of arch in your author's voice. Am I right in thinking that you shared some of Cecily's skeptical difference from just the obsession with which some of these men approach these collections?
I did, and it came out in the research and really became a core of what inspired the book, was that these collectors, mostly men, all very wealthy, because you had to be wealthy to have the space and the resources to acquire all of these things, were in some ways just a very petty and competitive community. There were these feuds among collectors who were angry at each other for, getting some rare object that the other one had wanted to get first, and very competitive about their reputations, and really obsessed with their legacies, with this idea that their collection was a representation of who they were and that it had to be preserved and protected throughout all eternity. And there's such human arrogance to that. So I did find it wasn't a community that I felt needed to be glorified in the novel.
Well, as you get at, and it ends up being somewhat of a plot point in here, this obsession with their collections living on after them. And it made me wonder, for people who are in this world of botany or who care about things like artifacts, do any of these collections remain relevant to anyone today?
I mean, certainly they do, and a lot at this time when the collections were being made, a lot of them were reforming what would become the foundation of contemporary museums, and continue to be resources for research. I mean, pressed plant specimens still exist in herbariums, and you can consult them and gain a huge amount of information about identifications for plants and the history of plant collecting and natural history. So in terms of their contribution to science, a lot of these objects have played a huge role. and continue to.
So where's that line between, they're contributing to science versus they're just being completely petty? They almost reminded me a little bit of how young men today will get so into pop culture and they might be just obsessing over one of these geek-oriented TV shows. Did you see more of the useful, or were there very few useful collections and most of it was just men showing off their knowledge?
I don't know. It's always a little bit of both, and it's so complex. The sets of motivations and genuine intellectual curiosity and excitement about learning more about the natural world versus more human considerations of vanity. In reality, I think a little bit of each exists in most people. Of course, in mysteries, one simplifies. So each of the different characters and each of the different suspects I tried to have be representative of different approaches. So there is one young Swedish scientist who is visiting who really just does care very much about identifying snakes and versus a young man who has a lot of money but doesn't have as much class and is kind of trying to use collecting to get into this cool kids club. So lots of different characters and very fun to play with that in writing a mystery.
And as you say, you're already working on a sequel, which is strongly hinted at there in the end. Do you have this one? Is the plot outlined?
That's the process I'm in right now, the outlining of the plot, the sketching out of the different suspects and how they appear versus how they really are. What I can say is that it takes place in northern England in County Durham, which is where Cecily grew up. So she is returning to her home. And of course, once she gets there, there will be a body will turn up.
A body will turn up. I got to ask, though, in our final question here, you're obviously very interested in the 18th century. You have all these through lines. Do you think you'll ever set a mystery in 18th century St. Louis? It seems like it might really lend itself to a great bloody murder plot.
It absolutely could, and I would love to at some point. I mean, 18th century or late 17th century would be one of the inns there would be the early Jesuits who were traveling around in the area like Père Marquette, and I had done some research on Jesuits in China for my first three books, so that would be one sort of research inroad for me. But yeah, when my mind's not in China or for now on the moors of northern England, I might absolutely turn to that.
Well, I hope we can convince you to do that because I would love to read that, and it doesn't have to be next. So, Elsa Hart, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Elsa's new mystery, that's The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne. It's a great read. Elsa's doing a virtual reading with Left Bank Books. That's at 7 p.m. this Thursday, August 20th, and you can join via Left Bank Books' Facebook page. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. That's 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.